Did you know that gluten, soy, and lectins aren't necessarily bad for our health? I know there's lots of information out there about these three uh, substances or foods that we find in our food. They're compounds that we find in our food that have taken a bad rap. And yes, there are certain situations when they are not good, but today we're going to go through the pros and the cons and what you need to know about gluten, soy, and lectins. And we're going to start with gluten. We're going to make this into a three-part series. So stay tuned for gluten, and we'll talk later about the soy and the lectins. All right. So let's dive into gluten and what gluten is. So as we explore gluten, actually gluten is a protein that is found in wheat, barley, and rye. And it is actually what's responsible for making it elastic. When you're looking at dough for bread or pastas, the gluten is what makes it stretchy. And I remember, OJ, I remember when I was taking food science and we were making bread, one of the ways to draw the gluten out is actually to knead it. And so, what we would do with our bread is knead it, and then we put it in the oven, in a warm oven, not too hot, but like just warm, a little bit warmer than room temperature because we didn't want to bake it. And it would have yeast in it that would uh, have oxygen being emitted. And so that oxygen that's coming from the yeast, it's an organism feeding off of sugar, would raise the bread and make it rise. And that's where and the stretchiness of the gluten is what would keep the bread together and get these pockets, air bubble pockets, and that's what would form our bread. And so gluten, that's where the gluten comes in. And you can get a high gluten flour that actually is used for making things like seitan, where it's like basically as soon as you add the water, it just like is like glued together and is makes it chewy and dense. So there's lots of uses for gluten, but we've also, heard that gluten isn't good for us. And so I want to explore that today. So if you are somebody with celiac, then absolutely, celiac is a disease that triggers that where the gluten actually triggers an autoimmune response that damages the small intestine. And if you have celiac disease, then you definitely need to avoid gluten and strictly avoid gluten. And so for people with celiac, there's gluten in things we don't even realize. And so just even a little bit of gluten can be very damaging for somebody with celiac disease. And as an example, as I have a couple of colleagues with celiac disease, and they have to avoid even if they wanted to have, let's say, French fries, and the fryer is if it's at a restaurant and they use that fryer for making things like breaded fish sticks or breaded chicken or anything like that, those little molecules of the breading that gets into the oil actually can be very harmful for somebody with celiac disease. So definitely, if you have celiac, you need to avoid it for sure. Now, there's other people who have sensitivities to gluten, but maybe not celiac, and they also, need to, I guess, if you're experiencing discomfort and you know that it's coming from the gluten or you suspect it, you may want to stay away from gluten. But for many other people, kind of the general population that doesn't have either a sensitivity or celiac disease, then gluten is not actually harmful and actually can be beneficial for us, especially if we're looking at whole grains. So we are going to check out a little bit more and do some pros and cons of our gluten. All right, let's go. Let me get this going here. All right. So let's do this pros and cons. So the first thing is that actually gluten can actually provide us with some essential nutrients. It is rich in B vitamins, also iron and fiber, which are important and necessary for our overall health. We've talked a lot about fiber and what fiber is for our gut, and how important it is to feed those good bacteria. So we can get that fiber and other essential nutrients from the gluten. It also, if you are somebody who is not has doesn't have a sensitivity, then or celiac disease, obviously, the gluten can actually be part of a healthy and balanced diet. And I think that's good news for people who love their bread, for sure. And I'm one of those people. I really enjoy bread. But then you also, I'm going to just play the flip side of the bread, is that if it's highly processed, you're getting a lot of stuff in it that maybe you don't want to have. But, there's nothing saying that you can't have gluten, and you just need to be very careful about, the fact whether if you're getting it in a processed bread. So, this is something that you could maybe make at home as well. And believe it or not, whole grains and that contain gluten, such as wheat, whole wheat, and barley, have actually been linked to reduced risk of heart disease. And gluten containing grains can actually support digestive health through the fiber content, which acts as a prebiotic. Again, this is where it is, we're getting the fiber in to uh, help with those good gut bacteria. It's the food for our good bacteria in our gut. On the con side of the chart, if you have celiac disease, gluten actually is a trigger for that autoimmune response, which leads to, as I already mentioned, damaging of the intestine, small intestine walls. And if you have a gluten sensitivity, then you could experience digestive discomfort or other symptoms when consuming gluten. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have celiac disease. I know for me, I went gluten free for quite a while. I'm not gluten free now, but I was gluten free for quite a while. And I did notice when I had some bread or I can't remember what it was, something with gluten in it for the first time. I did notice a difference. And so for me right now, I'm not staying away from gluten because I really don't feel I have that sensitivity. I feel like I'm in that general population, but I try to avoid it. I don't have it very often. It's kind of a treat for me. It's not something I eat on a regular basis. And if you, the other thing with gluten is it will be something that you're going to find in processed foods. And it can actually, those processed foods are typically low in nutrients and high in unhealthy additives. And even, I'm going to say, even like processed bread, when you buy bread, uh, if you look at the label, there's some pretty not so good ingredients in there, and some of them are things that you probably can't pronounce. And as they say, if you can't pronounce it, you probably shouldn't be eating it. And then gluten, actually, if you have a sensitivity, it can interfere with the nutrient absorption and potentially lead to having deficiencies in your diet. So, overall, you really need to understand the pros and cons, and that'll help you to make your own informed decision of whether or not you want to add gluten into your diet. And most people, it can that we can have it, but if you have, like I said, if you're celiac disease or you have a sensitivity, then you probably should stay away from it. Now, one more thing I want to address here, and that is sourdough bread and how that works for both the gluten content and our gut health. So sour bread is different than regular bread, like traditionally, because it uses natural fermentation process that has wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria. And that's so when you have those in the process of making the bread, it actually will break down some of the gluten and make the bread easier to digest. And so typically when you're making sourdough bread, you're using flour, water, and salt, and without any commercial yeast. And so what does this do in terms of the gluten? Excuse me. It actually will, the fermentation process will break down the gluten proteins or some of them, and it makes it easier to digest. And so that will help people who have gluten sensitivities. They may not have as much issue with the gluten if it's a sourdough bread. And the lactic acid bacteria will produce enzymes that will help to degrade the gluten. And so while sourdough bread is not gluten free, it generally has lower levels of gluten compared to regular bread. And so what that does is it enhances the digestibility because the fermentation process also breaks down some of the phytic acid, which is an anti-nutrient found in grains that can interfere with the absorption of minerals like magnesium, iron, and calcium. And it also enhances the nutritional value of the bread and allows us to have better absorption of the minerals. It also, sourdough bread is lower FODMAP content. So the sourdough fermentation process reduces the levels of fructans, which is a FODMAP that can cause digestive discomfort in people who have irritable bowel syndrome. And so this can make it more tolerable for people who have irritable bowel syndrome. And so the benefits of sourdough bread when you're looking at our gut health is first that the lactic acid bacteria that is in the sourdough fermentation process is actually gives us probiotics as well as we get the prebiotics from the fiber. And we have it will be lower on the glycemic index as well. So sourdough bread is lower on the glycemic index than regular bread. And so that means it will have a slower, more gradual release into our blood sugar levels. And so that will aid us in control of blood sugar and our overall metabolic health. As well, there is definitely a different taste and texture when we are eating sourdough bread. So it has a more tangy flavor and more chewy texture. And so you may or may not find that appealing. It was something for me I got to get used to. I wasn't certainly wasn't used to it at first, but you can definitely acquire a taste. And so this is something that in our house we will try and get a sourdough bread versus a regular bread. And at this point, I haven't tried making my own sourdough bread. I know it's more involved, but maybe someday I'll try making it myself. So I want to remind you that if you are celiac disease, then sourdough bread does not. It is not gluten free, so this is something you need to stay away from. And if you have gluten sensitivity, it may or may not allow you to tolerate gluten in the bread, but it's something that I think you could try if you wanted to. And then uh, if you're eating an artisanal sourdough bread, it will go through a longer fermentation process as opposed to kind of a commercial bread process. And it will be more beneficial for your gut health compared to a commercially produced sourdough bread, which will likely contain yeast and preservatives in it. So overall, if you're interested in reducing your gluten content without sacrificing having bread, an artisanal sourdough bread may be a good option for you, a little bit healthier and better for your digestive system, and add those probiotics for you. All right. So I think at the end of the day, when you're looking at gluten, certainly if you have a sensitivity or a celiac disease, it's probably something to avoid. But for kind of the general population, really it's your choice of, maybe you can have a choice whether you want to have be gluten free or to include gluten in your diet. For me, I don't go looking for gluten, and when we're eating pastas and stuff, we may go with a rice pasta instead of a whole wheat or a wheat pasta, and so we minimize the gluten, but we're not staying gluten free. We still keep the options open at certain times. And also, if you are eating some of the vegan fake meat kind of things, like they usually have seitan, or those can very easily be something that contains the high gluten. Seitan is one option, and so that gives it the chewy flavor. Those definitely will have gluten. So if you are eating things like that, it's definitely not part of a whole food plant-based lifestyle. But if you are eating some of those products, just be careful and read your labels, especially if you want to stay gluten free. All right. So I think that will wrap up the discussion for today. Before we end, OJ, any questions from you?
That was an amazing session. And
Thank
I really
you.
like the fact that we could talk about gluten. My question is some people say oats contain gluten, but I would really like to know, do oats contains gluten like they say?
So believe it or not, yes, oats can contain gluten. You can buy oats that are gluten free,
Okay.
and I I'm going to check and I'm going to get back to you tomorrow. But I believe it's from the process, like from the harvesting process. But let me get back to you on why oats have gluten. And you can, like I said, you can buy gluten-free oats. It's something that you need to look for if you are have a sensitivity or you're staying gluten-free. Um, but let me look into that and I will give you an answer tomorrow. when we talk about soy is going to be next on the list.
Okay, that would be great.
All right. So join us tomorrow when we talk about soy. Today we talked about the pros and cons of gluten, and we also talked about lowering your gluten if you're eating bread by using sourdough bread. So if you like this, share it with somebody else, and like and subscribe to our channel. And we will see you tomorrow for a continuing discussion on gut health and talking about soy and the pros and cons of soy. See you tomorrow.